Enter Prepared ALHWays Television, helping viewers find biblically based safe passage through today's turbulent times. It's all about always for abundant living in harm's way.
The city's crying out for redemption. It's people longing for your love. We see the fields are ripe for salvation. There's never been a better time than this. This is the day of the Lord. This is the hour I was born for. Sing hallelujah, hallelujah, amen. This is the Lamb of our King. We declare Him as we sing. Sing hallelujah, hallelujah, amen.
Hello, I'm Kerry Fink, and it is my pleasure to introduce you to Sam Townsend today. Sam often describes himself as with a laugh, a recovering banker, but he's a financial expert and has really devoted several decades of his life to what we call sustainable living, or better yet, biblically sustainable living. So one of the questions I have to ask you about all this is, a lot of people talk about how difficult times are now, and that they fear that times may get more dramatic and more challenging than they are even today. So how would you say preparing for the coming difficult times would compare to those people that were talking about the Y2K situation?
Interesting. Y2K was an event that might or might not cause significant damage and problems to civilization. One of the reasons I was interested in it at the time was I recognized the difficulties that many of them that modern society is facing, and that was an opportunity to address them. But people have difficulty getting prepared for things which they may or may not happen, and they're not sure when they're going to happen. Y2K was whatever was going to happen, they knew when it was going to happen. So it was one of those things that was easy to focus on.
So you had a sense of when the crisis was going to occur.
Whatever might or might not happen was going to happen then.
Right.
Yeah. When the clock switched over to 1 minute after midnight.
Well, there's also a point, though, that with Y2K, wasn't it that it was considered to be a glitch in the system for a certain period of time? Was at the time people thinking this was a short-term solution that they had to get through? Or was it more like a lot of people say today, where the financial circumstances and the problems that are facing us are really almost insurmountable in the current systems?
I think mainly, that's a good question. I think mainly it was people thought it was a relatively short-term problem. It could be very severe, but they weren't really talking about the rest of their lives, when they addressed it. Unlike, I think, what we're facing today.
One of the things, for those of you that may not be aware, we're producing a television series here and a series of programs called Abundant Living in Harm's Way. And all of this stems from a number of books that actually Sam Townsend has put together over the years, where he's taken his financial expertise and kind of studied what the marketplace looks like and where it's headed, and coming up with the fact that we really could be in harm's way. Could you elaborate a little bit on what you see as the situations that create this perfect storm of challenge?
Well, you're talking about Y2K, and that was a phenomenon because of the way the programmers had programmed computers, that they weren't prepared to deal with moving into another millennium. To a great extent, the problems that we have today, which absolutely do place us in harm's way, and we have been for some time, it's just a question of finding the appropriate triggers to create the real problems, really have to do with the foundations, in effect the computer code, if you will, of the way modern society is structured. And the foundations of modern society are built on sand, some of the most important ones, and one, of course, being the way the financial system is set up.
Well, is there a time frame, like people talk about, when does the big one hit? How do you see this? How do you know how to prepare? Like you said, with Y2K, you know there's a specific date. You would set your clock, you would know when that was going to come, and either you were okay or not. But this seems a little bit more frightening because nobody's sure when the other shoe is going to drop, so to speak.
Actually, the shoes are dropping now. Sometimes they're dropping so softly that most people don't hear them, but that there are things happening, and these are indicators of what's coming. But the really systemic problems, like the collapse of the North American power grid, which was the concern with Y2K, that was one of the major concerns, that's still a threat. And the power grid today is more stressed than it was then. We've got higher percentages of use and so forth. So it's actually, the situation is actually more tenuous today. The global economy, it's highly interdependent. Global financial system, highly interdependent. And then we've even broken down these into other systems of living, whether it's the healthcare system. You can pick any industry you want, we can talk about it. And we do that in Abundant Living in Harm's Way. We look at every aspect of living and all the economic activity.
Well, as a financial expert who's studied markets and you understand the way things are headed and you've put all the pieces together, what should somebody do if they're looking at how they're handling their finances and their portfolio and the things? How would you advise them? What should be planning? Because they're not sure that something is going to happen, or maybe they are sure something's going to happen, but they don't know how to time it or how to think their way through. How much time do they have to prepare?
Well, what they actually need to do is focus on what they have and what the threats are to it. One thing we have to focus on is what threatens the status quo, what threatens what it is that we would like to do. Financial planning, in its essence, its simplest essence, is determining whether people are going to have enough. And more specifically, are they going to have enough when they need it? And are in the appropriate vehicles, and to deal with being able to produce the assets and resources we need at the time we need them. And normally this is focused upon cash. Will we have enough? Will we be able to convert our assets to cash to buy what we need, whether they're goods or services, when it is down the lifetime that we're going to need them? The problem is that we face threats with the basic essence of what money is. And we don't know what the half-life of money is right now. What we've known as money may not be functioning months or years down the road. We don't know. So it complicates the process, but there are ways we can focus on how we have the assets that we need at the time that we need them, in the form that we need them.
Now, what about, some people say, well, we went through all this crisis in like 2007, 2008, and that things seem to be going in the right direction. What would you say to the people who say, I don't know, it seems like the crisis is over, we should just go back to business as usual? What do you say to those people?
Well, one thing we have to look at is what's the reality, and then the other one, the related question, which I think you may have in mind, is why do people think what they think? We run into people every day that obviously have a somewhat different grasp on reality, or the lack thereof, that we think we have. And but what we saw in 07 and 08 was really the first leg down in what is really a large-scale topping process. Actually, from a number of standpoints, the markets started topping a decade ago. And in real money terms, in real purchasing power terms, the stock market, for example, is lower today than it was a decade ago. And but one thing we know about markets is, Bernard Baruch once said, they fluctuate, and they do. And the fluctuations provide opportunities to either gain or lose. You can only have capital gains or losses when the markets are moving. So if it's flat line, you don't. But the concerns people have today increasingly are to be able to preserve the purchasing power of the assets that they have, and also to get some kind of return. And in an era when interest rates are so low, obviously earning interest is not a guaranteed fine way to generate returns. So they need to rethink how they generate those returns. And also, will they have enough? How do they time it? How do the various assets they have relate to their life cycle needs, and particularly how those needs might be changing in a rapidly changing environment?
Well, a lot of people talk about this debt ceiling thing, and they say it's like really a political decision. Are they going to raise the debt ceiling in America? What will they do? How will they react to that? But it sounds like your opinion is that that's maybe not even exactly the question that should be asked in all of it.
It's an important question, but it's not the main question. And all that represents is it's an aggregate amount of funded debt of the federal government, but that's actually a relatively small percentage of their total obligations. And the scary thing is when you start adding up all the different debts of the governments, the government agencies, the contingent liabilities, because one thing that happened in 07, 08 was government, instead of being a lender of last resort, has become a lender of first resort. Virtually all the home mortgage loans that are made today are made with the backing of the federal government or its agencies. And right now, this huge funded debt is at extremely low interest rates. They've also shortened the maturities on their debt, so it turns very quickly. So if rates were to increase sharply, you would have a rather rapid increase in the total interest obligation of the federal government. So we've created a debt trap here. I talk about this in Harm's Way Financial Planning and Asset Management with the diagrams and everything to your heart's content. You can understand why this is, and also about what's happening in this topping process and how it relates to previous major periods of economic change, declining markets. The last major one was two generations ago, and that produced the crash of '29 and the Great Depression. Well, the deflation, the economic contraction and the contraction of debt of the Great Depression didn't end until the late 40s. This was a long-term process. This one's going to be bigger. This is larger degree.
Well, with that kind of a dire prognosis, how does somebody on an individual level, hedge where they are and what they could be doing? How would they reposition their financial affairs? And is it too late to do something about it?
No, it's not too late, and there is absolutely things they can do. And as we point out in Abundant Living in Harm's Way, there are many things that many people are doing. And the key to it is not to be under the system when it collapses on top of you. But it requires that we gain the necessities of life and enjoy them and use them in local economies where people actually live. So in a way, it requires us to kind of disconnect from this global economy and global system, where we produce the necessities of life locally, which also is a much healthier way, and we talk about that.
Right. Now, how would you contrast that or compare that with folks who are like survivalists, where they might say, well, I've got a bunker, I've got ammunition, I've got freeze-dried food. Is that what we're talking about here?
Actually, in part we are. If you refer to them as survivalists, these are people that they've broken the code to the extent that they understand the bad things that can happen. And there are periods of time here, you still got a bridge from where you are to get there. To gear this thing up, to produce what we need to produce, you've got to deal with the temporary problems. It's like after a hurricane.
Right.
If the power goes off, you can't get food in the stores. How are you going to live for a couple of weeks until it gets there? That's essentially the idea. Even in Abundant Living in Harm's Way, we need to the temporary positioning. We have to pre-position the things that we're going to need. And ideally, we pre-position all the things that we're going to need, not only for the emergencies, but also to support us in the community and on the far side of that crisis, if there is a far side of that crisis.
Right. It's probably a good time to interject the fact that one of the things that ALHWays is actually the acronym that's been trademarked for that, because it really speaks to what the Bible teaches us about how we're supposed to enjoy life no matter what the external circumstances are. And there is one side of Abundant Living in Harm's Way, or ALHWays, that we call Prepared in Case. And it actually addresses this short-term need to make sure that, if the tsunami is coming or the earthquake is coming or any type of situation that might interrupt daily life as we know it, anything from a terrorist attack to, we've heard this year about the incredible amount of tornado activities or hurricanes and things like that, that there is a need to be ready and have a plan in place to move through that kind of a phase.
Yeah, it's an absolutely necessary component, and Prepared in Case focuses on that need.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, though, in the long term, that's not enough, is it, though?
It's not, and interestingly enough, if we're already operating in a mode that has us fully prepared for whatever happens, either good times, bad times, then you don't have as great a need for the emergency provisioning and so forth. Although you have to deal with the recognition that if anybody is not participating in your system, they're either a potential drain or a threat to those who are. So we really have to consider everyone within the region or the area that's appropriate.
So when we talk about sustainable living, that's actually something, the very word sustainable means ongoing. And in the abundant living in harm's way or always mentality, we call that prepared always. And so when you talk about that, we talk about sustainable communities, and some people say, well, it might be a flight community, but describe what that actually is.
Well, it's the recognition that, as we were saying, that whatever that the appropriate local economy or community group is, and those within a reasonable access to it, need to be able to be supported. And if you're, for example, living in the middle of Washington, D.C., which is the real ground zero, we were just talking with some friends this past week on that, who operate a business and ministry right in metropolitan Washington. Well, they basically got to get out of Dodge. And the only way a metropolitan area like that can be made sustainable is to rely upon support from the areas around it, and also to have the people within the area be able to become a functioning part of those communities. The flight community is the other extreme. This is where people collect in an area where there aren't a lot of people around, but that the land, there's enough land and water and so forth that they can produce an agriculturally based, renewable community, and then bring in the necessary people and resources it takes. You can do the same thing with the household level. You can do the same thing on a neighborhood level, and we address all of those situations, which all taken together, when they're in place, if they're around perhaps a major metropolitan area like Atlanta, for example, that then the whole city, the whole area could become sustainable.
Well, and another point with that is when they talk about sustainable, compare and contrast that with, we've all heard the term off the grid, or people who are like environmentalists. Is this the same thing, or is this a different?
They can be the same, and of course with these movements, as you know, you've got all kinds of motives and all kinds of perspectives of people who are in them. But off the grid simply means that you can continue to function if the grid goes down. Green is a recognition that we need to be environmentally friendly. One of the reasons, and it's a major reason, that our society is in so much trouble is not sustainable in the ways that we have known it, is because of the damage we've done to virtually every aspect of the economy. But most of these aspects don't get talked about because it's not in the vested interest of governments and businesses to blow the whistle on the problems that they are helping to create. So, but things like the quality of the water supply, if you examine all the things that are in your tap water, for example, I mean, it really would alarm you.
Frighten you.
There are ways to operate where you're not faced with all of those threats. And a truly abundant, sustainable community would do that. You'd have fresh water sources or the means of purifying it with the means at hand. And same thing with agriculture. You wouldn't be relying on pesticides and chemical fertilizers and so forth. You'd be using the natural elements. Interestingly enough, the one who authored the statement about abundant living in harm's way, John 10:10b, is the one who designed this environment in the first place, including us, the centerpiece of the environment, to function in a harmonious relationship, with him, with one another, and the environment itself.
Right.
That's what the model is that we're seeking to follow.
Well, it's one of the things that's interesting about abundant living in harm's way. We spend a lot of time researching things, and one of the things that's interesting to note is we aren't really creating a movement or anything like that, but we really find ourselves tracking the amazing number of people who at some level are wired into this thing. We've made the comment before that there really are parallel systems. There are systems that exist, and then people who choose to move in a different line, parallel, not threatening to an existing system, but parallel. A great example of that, for example, is homeschoolers. Most people who are parents are busy paying taxes for the public education system, and whether they choose to send their kids to a private school or more frequently these days, as much as anything else, they may be involved in homeschooling, and they're making a conscious decision to pay for that twice. Right. The same thing occurs for people who say, I want to move in an agricultural way. You know, we're seeing such a resurgence of these people who say, I want to have a garden in my backyard. I want to turn my property into something that's going to really help my family. So instead of walking down the street and purchasing government subsidized agriculture, they're making a conscientious decision to go ahead and plant their own garden and take that into account. How do you speak to those people? Because it really seems like it's a growing number of people every day who are tackling that, whether it be in the case of alternative health care, where they say they want to take more responsibility for their own wellness and wholeness. How do you speak to those people? Do they fit under the ALHWays umbrella?
Yeah, I say amen and hallelujah and keep on trucking because that's what it takes. In fact, that's a major part of the cure for the healthcare crisis. Most people view the healthcare crisis as a problem of inadequate access and excessive cost. The reality is there's too much access to a system which really isn't a healthy system in many respects. And it's uneconomic, it's harmful, it's got collateral damage in spades. So, but if people are part of a healthy system, they don't get sick in the first place. Right. And we emphasize not only most of our conversation has been talking about the physical, but there's also the relational and the spiritual. And if you really analyze why people get sick, you have to deal with all those elements. The root causes of the disease get back into the relational and spiritual issues in many cases, and not just the environmental ones.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's important to think about. Let's go back to a question, because one of the things I've heard you be a strong proponent of is that sustainable living is good for people who are haves and for people who are have-nots. Right. But if we're talking to somebody that's a have, and they say, okay, I've got some resources, I need to think of the right way to work with those going forward, what would be your advice? I've heard you talk a lot about the ability to have substantial resources into tangible assets and things like that, as opposed to assets that may be paper or fiat or whatever.
A basic thing that we need to grasp is that sustainable living in a tangible, healthful, local way is much more labor intensive, much more people. See, one of the things that's made the global village work is we've divided the division of labor to fund people provided by people across the oceans or whatever, but the financial system has enabled that. If the financial system went down, the global division of labor would end, just like that. But locally, you need more arms and legs. So the person that's out there, the farmer said, I could really gear up my production, but I need more people. And there's nobody within 5 or 10 miles of me that I can get to work for me. Well, part of our strategies is to get people out there that are mentored into learning the skills it takes. And also, it's a very healthy environment. You're in an environment that you don't have toxins, you don't have a lot of the concerns and the hectic, harmful activities, and so we can bring the labor out. Now, if they need capital, and some of these people aren't good business people, they really have a passion for what they're doing, and many of them even are motivated to teach, which is good, because we need a broader distribution of these skills. But we can help bring the capital in. So instead of investing in intangible assets like stocks, bonds, annuities, and so forth, which in our environment are beginning to look like perishable commodities, they can move into tangible resources that not only hold their value but can be used to produce greater value, and even could be exchanged in times of crisis with or without cash. Without cash, it's commonly called barter. So in effect, you develop a cooperative economy that's based upon exchanging real services of local value and also tangible assets.
Right. So would you say if there was somebody that had some resources, would they hedge themselves by investing now into like a sustainable community, or so their family and close by people would have a place to go? Or
Absolutely.
what would you tell them they should do?
More and more people are becoming concerned about some of the traditional, conventional, intangible investments. So they've been building cash, but they're concerned there's no real return on cash. But as this deflationary decline resumes, and I believe it's resuming now after a period of about a 2-year rally in this major topping process, cash is going to be king for a period of time. It's not because the currencies are getting any stronger, it's just that but what you can buy with them, because of the tremendous demand for liquidity, is you can get tremendous deals on things. I anticipate that in general commodities prices will be coming down again, as they did in 08 and 09 after topping in 07. Same thing's happening again. And this time it could be even more secure. So if you got liquidity, you use this period of time and you use that liquidity to acquire the assets that will be useful in a sustainable living environment.
So if you're looking at a sustainable living community, where are these located and how many of these can there be?
They can be almost anywhere. Where I find it's the easiest way to do it is to build upon what's already there. Build upon, if you've got an agricultural community nearby, you've got people that've got these skills, help them do more of it. Find out what their heart is, find out what their passion is, find out what they need, bring in what they need.
So the kind of work that you do is you're helping people figure these questions out. So in your research, what would be like an ideal amount of land needed, or the ideal number of families that might work together on a project list like this? Or how would you say that gets put together?
There are plenty of documented examples. There are great books written that show that you can support a family of 4 on a quarter acre to a half acre of a bio-intensive, local farming effort. So it doesn't take a huge amount of ground. It's a simple way to grasp it. So there are very efficient ways to do it. So you can support large numbers of people in many different places, different climates. Now the different techniques that you use in different climates, but and there are more labor-intensive solutions, and some are more bio-intensive or capital-intensive, such as aquaponics, which combines hydroponics and aquaculture. It is a bigger capital investment, but it can make you almost completely independent of the need for any outside resources, and it can do it with much less labor.
Yep. Now we're seeing a lot of groups. We hear about CSAs, but we see a lot of church groups banding together. They're doing like these community farms. We're aware of some here in our area that are actually where the government has taken a piece of property that was not being used for any other purpose and allowed now groups to come in and start working that land. Talk a little bit about that. Is this like is this connected to the churches, or what's the relationship?
Some of them are, some of them aren't. The CSAs you talked about, typically on a subscription basis, neighbors come together, they agree to pay a certain amount a month, and for that they're going to get market baskets of food. If they have great harvests, they get a little more. If they have less, they get a little less. So there's kind of sharing in the risk. But they can also participate labor-wise, and there are a variety of ways to do this. As you pointed out, there are many, many properties. You drive around, you look around, you see a lot of undeveloped properties. Well, all of these could produce something. And but it requires a change in mindset. From a real estate development standpoint, the developers, what they do is typically they acquired expensive properties near where people live and then build really expensive buildings on them. Well, many of those are now standing idle, and more of them will be standing idle. So the challenge in this is you get a piece of property that's a much less expensive piece of property. You build value in it as a agriculturally productive entity. You move your population around that. That's the kind of real estate development that's the payoff. That's going to be the big payoff.
Right. Now, with Always Abundant Living in Harm's Way, the company, you're actually involved in helping people work through all these challenges, whether it be from a standpoint of a community, a sustainable living community, consulting with groups that are getting into this. You've written books on the topic. You're doing a television show on the topic. There's so many different areas. Is Always a for-profit or a not-for-profit kind of organization?
Well, Always itself is for profit, but the vehicles that we use in this were also nonprofit vehicles. Some of them are health and wholeness oriented. Some of them deal with you mentioned the capital have-nots. The system has to work for both the haves and the have-nots. And as more and more people are underemployed every day, more and more people every day are looking for opportunities to work for food, particularly to do it in a healthy way, and with dignity, and with and arm in arm with mutually supportive members of the community. And so there are plenty of opportunities to do this. And a lot of this involves nonprofit. Unfortunately, in our time, you've got a relatively small percentage of the population that have any capital, and many of them are losing capital every day. So if the people with the capital don't make the right moves, we've got big time problems. So we do have to focus on them, help them put the situations together where they can accommodate bringing in participants, or participating with where the people are, and this includes those that have capital, those that don't, and part of it involves, and you've referred to this earlier, the idea of leveraging the skills, experiences, and abilities that people have. Even if some of them have become relatively rare in our time, there's an opportunity to gear them up. Part of what we can do with media, of course, is not only to promote that, but also educate in how to do it.
Right. I was going to say that's a big part of Always, is taking this vast body of knowledge and this research from everything that's going on around the country and putting it together in a form that is available in multimedia forms, whether it be videos that are streamed on the website. They're available on Christian television stations around the country. There's some radio resources available. There's also newsletters and different materials like that.
Let's not miss the most important one, and that is the hard copy. You know, if the grid goes down, you know, all you've got. So if we've got manuals, we may get an electronic version, but if it's something you're going to need to refer to, you better have a hard copy. And also, pencils, papers, and manual typewriters will make a comeback.
And that's why the book part of it is very important as well. So at the end of the day, would you say this is bad news we're giving people, or good news?
It could be the best news they've ever heard. You know, the bad news. The bad news is that things aren't going to look like you would have liked to have thought they were going to look like, or they look like in the past. The good news is we've got something better, and actually the creator designed it a long time ago. We're just catching up. People have been living sustainably for thousands of years. What makes it tough now is what we've done to it. And so we've got, everybody's in transition whether they realize it or not. They're in transition from where they are you know, to where they're going. We'd like to think it would be, you know, where we get them to live abundantly in good times or in bad, and joyfully in health, economically, and in a mutually supportive community that's a joyful group of people to live and work with.
So you'd say, come on in, the water's fine.
I think so. Feels good.
All right. Well, thank you, Sam, for being with us today on this. I'm Kerry Fink for Abundant Living in Harm's Way.